The next speaker is Chris Anderson, and Chris Anderson is the editor of Wired magazine, right, Chris? There's several Chris Andersons, but this one is the editor of Wired magazine, and he's also the father of 5, which I consider even more impressive. And he's still married, which is even more impressive. Father of 5, author, editor, all the good stuff. Chris and I did a panel at South by Southwest this year in which we discussed the topic of free and freemium, and it was a very enjoyable little panel. It was, if you will, Mark Zuckerberg and Sarah Lacey done right is how we positioned it, right? So because of that panel and that fireside chat and the topic, he was cognizant of what happened this morning on the panel. He was watching the tweets from the panel. And to just summarize it, these kids basically said they'd pay for nothing. So what better speaker than Chris Anderson from Wired talking about Free, his new book. Chris.
Thanks. So I think I'm allowed to wander around. Thank you, Guy, for inviting me to this. I basically will do everything Guy asked me to do. My business model is to follow his lead and hope for the best, and that's worked out pretty well for me. I'm going to talk for about half an hour just to give you kind of just some overview of the context of free, the history of free. Maybe free as a business model, all the misunderstandings about free, and then hopefully I really want to turn into a kind of a tactical conversation about business models built around free, in particular freemium, which is mostly what I'm focused on. And so I'm going to try to stick to a half an hour, and then the rest of the time to questions. So please keep them in mind. This will be fun if it's conversational. As you heard this morning in the panel, a generation has grown up online expecting things to be free, and not because they're entitled or brats or that we're training them wrong, but because they've internalized digital economics the way they internalized Newtonian mechanics when they learned how to catch a ball. It is just, I have five kids, average age is 6. They're growing up online. When I tell them that I'm writing a book about how it's possible for things to be online, free online, digital, because they're digital, they're like, "You're joking. Dad, you wrote a book about how stuff is free online? Isn't it just sort of blindingly obvious?" And I say, well, maybe to you smart 6-year-old kid, but to people of my generation, it's not considered obvious. It's considered wrong. It's considered economically illiterate. I mean, I can't tell you how many times over the last year I've had people come up to me and said, "Oh, you poor deluded guy, don't you realize there's no such thing as a free lunch?" And I mean, just to have every economic truism thrown in my face to be told that this can't be true. It's a scam. It's a trick, and I don't understand basic Econ 101. So I have half the audience, half the potential audience out there saying no way, and the other half the audience saying duh. And therein lies a very interesting subject. So I would argue that free is perhaps the most misunderstood word in the English language. Certainly the most misunderstood 4-letter word beginning with F in the English language. And it's misunderstood for all sorts of reasons. It's misunderstood partly because of simple semantics. The word free in the English language has 2 meanings. This is unique. Well, not entirely unique, but it's mostly only found in English. In Latinate languages like French and Spanish and Italian, there's 2 words. One comes from libra, the Latin root libra, which means freedom, as in free speech, freedom of expression. The other is gratis, as in no price. You have libra and gratis. Now, in open source, we've been wrestling with these 2 meanings of free, as in clarifying that free is in speech, not free is in beer, or sometimes it's free is in beer, but not free is in speech, or sometimes it's both, and actually it's not all that clarifying. But that is the general construction. Generally, free as in speech, liberty is considered a good thing. Free as in no price is considered a possibly a good thing, but possibly a trick. We're skeptical. In other languages, you separate the two. Libre is always good, and gratis is possibly good, but you need to be suspicious. In English, by munging them together into the same word, we get the positive connotations of liberty, which then draw people towards gratis, and we take advantage of the ambiguity. Just as an aside, you may be interested in the etymology of the word free. Why is it that the two meanings are mixed up in English? It's because they both derive from the same Old English derivation from Norse influences. That in England in the 1200s or so, society was set up around tribal lines. And what you would have in every community, in every village, is you'd have two classes. There would be slaves and family members. The slaves were tied to you both economically and in terms of liberty. You had to provide for their support, the room and board. So, they weren't free to you. There was an economic cost to those slaves. They were also not free to go. They were slaves. Whereas your family members, services were rendered without pay. You don't charge your family members, or expect services for providing a room and board. But they were also free to go. And so the two meanings of liberty and no cost come from this divide between social ties and economic ties. And the word friend, by the way, comes from the exact same root. A friend is someone who's tied to you through the social ties rather than the economic ties. So the two are, liberty and gratis are actually connected in that very root. So that's the semantic confusion of the word free. The historical confusion of the word free is that in ways that we haven't fully internalized, the meaning of free as an economic force has changed from the 20th century to the 21st. And I'll start in the 20th century with this guy, Frank Woodward, who was the CEO of a company called Genesee Pure Foods in 1896. And he'd bought a concoction called Jell-O and tried to make a go of it. The late 1800s were the birth of what we consider modern packaged goods, modern consumer packaged goods industry, including everything about productization of commodities and branding of commodities. Prior to that, the typical retail experience was in a general store, and you had food was largely fresh goods. It was produce and meat and such. And there was a tiny fraction of packaged goods, and they were all behind the counter. You had to ask them all by name. At the end of the 1800s, you started to see the first foods that were put in boxes. And those foods that were put in boxes, because you didn't have refrigeration, et cetera, they had to have long shelf life. They would tend to be powders. So you had baking soda, you had yeast, and some sugars. And again, because these boxes of powders were behind the counter, you had to point to things and ask for them by name. So we had to introduce brands with those boxes so you knew what to call them. So Fleischmann's yeast and Arm & Hammer baking soda. And the beginning of branding was all about to get people to point at something from across the counter. The problem with Jell-O was that it was not just an unfamiliar brand, but it was an unfamiliar substance. People didn't understand what this gelatin thing was. And that's because prior to this, the only way to get gelatin was to boil calves' hooves all afternoon and fish bones, and it was gross and smelly and disgusting, and people didn't do it much. But they invented a way in the abattoir to press it out in sheets and then to grind it up into a powder so it could be reconstituted in water. And so we now had a way that gelatin was cheap and easy and clean and nice. And so, but it wasn't part of the daily diet. It wasn't an understood part of the kitchen. So they had to introduce the concept of powdered gelatin as well as the brand. So what they did is they realized they had this fleet of trucks which are used to deliver goods to the local stores. And they said, well, maybe we'll sell door to door. Maybe the way to promote this new product was to go door to door. But then they discovered that at the time there were regulations that required a license for door to door salesmen. And that was a hassle, and they couldn't afford it. But there was a loophole. And the loophole was you needed no license to give away things door to door. This was designed to allow religious pamphleteers to distribute religious information without license. So you could give away things door to door, but you couldn't sell. So what's the question? Their question was, what could we give away door to door? And so they came up with this. It was a recipe book. They printed 5 million of them in the first 3 years. And they were beautifully illustrated. The greatest illustrators of the day, including Norman Rockwell, helped create these recipe books. So they gave away the recipe books door to door to the housewives, which is what they were at the time. And then they would go to the local merchant and they say, you're about to see a flood of people coming in asking for this thing called Jell-O, and you should stock it, and we have a bunch of boxes in the back of the truck. And so that's how it worked. Now think about what this is. They gave away something, this book, which was useful and interesting and enticing in its own, but useless without the product Jell-O. The recipes all required Jell-O. You needed the Jell-O to take advantage, to make use of the book. The recipe book was first a pamphlet and then a book, enticed you and offered something of utility, but only with a necessary ingredient that you had to buy. And so that worked, and Jell-O became a fixture in the American home. And 3 years later, King Gillette did the exact same thing with the razor and the blade. You give away the razor and sell the blade. Now, that's actually not true. It's an urban myth. King Gillette never gave away the razor. What he did is he sold the razor at a discount to banks, and then the banks gave him away as part of a save and shave campaign. Nevertheless, the consequence was the same, which was that you got one thing which had value, but could not be, the utility could not be extracted without buying something else, the blade. And it shifted the revenues of King Gillette from the Gillette Company from a point of sale one time to an ongoing annuity. Now, what you see, and then we saw the same thing happen and pretty much defined 20th century marketing. Free became a very conventional way to entice people in. Buy one, get one free, free gift inside, loss leaders, all this kind of stuff. You know, the use of the word free is used because it became ubiquitous because it's powerful. But it's not a new economic model. Note that in all these cases, you're still paying. You know, you didn't pay for the recipe book, but you paid for the Jell-O. You didn't pay for the razor, but you paid for the blade. You're not paying for the cell phone, but you're paying for the minutes. It's still you. It's not this pocket, it's this pocket. It's not now, it's later, but it's not really free, which is why people keep telling me there's no such thing as a free lunch, and why 20th century free belongs in quotes. It is a trick. It is a very effective trick. It is a marketing gimmick of the highest order, but it's not a true economic model. Okay, I would not have written a book called Free if that were the end of the story. What's happened over from the 20th to the 21st century is that we've shifted from an economy of atoms to an economy of bits. If you've read Nicholas Negroponte's Being Digital, or George Gilder's Microcosm, Kevin Kelly's New Rules for the New Economy, many others, you will know very well what's different about bits. Fundamentally, it's that they have near zero marginal costs of production and distribution. This is unique to the digital world. There's another difference, which is a little more subtle, which is that it's a deflationary economy. The world of atoms is the world of limited resources, commodities, land, labor, etc. It's inflationary. Whatever you do in the atoms world tends to get more expensive over time. In the bits world, we know about Moore's law. Right, 18-month halving in cost. What the internet did is it took Moore's law and combined it with its equivalents in storage and bandwidth, where the cost declines are even faster. Storage falls in price by 50% every 14 months, and bandwidth falls in price by 50% every year. You put the three together, storage, bandwidth, and processing, and you have the general truism that whatever you're doing online today, it'll cost you half as much a year from now, and so on forever. So if it costs YouTube, 0.002 cents to stream a video today, it'll be 0.001 cent in a year, and so on. We've never seen a deflationary economy work as fast and as long as this has. So there have been moments in industrial economies that we've had deflationary incidents. When muscle power went to steam power, it suddenly got cheaper, and then it got more expensive again as inflationary economics kicked in. As steam power went to electricity, same thing, step change, and then got expensive again. As hand production went into mass production, and we got the assembly line, once again a step change, but which had incredible deflationary effects and made products cheaper for a while until those advantages were internalized, and then they got expensive again. Digital goods are the first ones that seem to be doing this year after year forever. The Moore's law has been working for 50 years. These other forces having come together, you get these compound declines in pricing. Someday, maybe this will change, but we seem to see deflationary forces at work, for decades more. And the consequence of deflationary forces is that it tends to drive price the same way. What we're seeing is a shift from the atoms world of razors to the virtual world of flaming digital swords, and these virtual these virtual goods, and I don't just mean games, although I'll get to games in a moment. These virtual goods, to use Stuart Brand's famous phrase, want to be free. They want to be free in the same way that water wants to flow downhill, in the same way that apples want to fall from the tree. This is closer to a force of physics than it is to a hippie prognosis or prescription. This is not a matter of philosophy. It's not a moral force. It's not Berkeley taking over the world. This is just what the consequences of the quantum effects on the semiconductor side, the photonic effects on the bandwidth side, and the electronic forces on the storage side have done. It is a force of gravity, and free is now sort of the given price. Those kids on the first panel are not wrong, and they're not spoiled brats, and they're not irresponsible. They've just internalized digital economics in the same way my kids have. They understand it on a level that hardly needs to be explained. I'll explain anyway. So as I went looking, I recognized that we've created a country-sized economy out there. You can argue about the size of the economy. One of the problems with the economy that's non-monetary is that's quite hard to measure in monetary terms. But clearly, the online economy is about the size of a country. You can argue about what size of country, or is Switzerland or Germany or Italy or whatever, but it's about a country. And the default price is zero. Not to say everything's zero, not to say you can't make money from zero. I'll come to that later. But the default price, as that panel told you, is zero. So there must be an economic model for that, right? We must have a framework to understand economies where the default price is zero. And curiously, we don't. And despite my best efforts, we still don't. But let me give you a stab at some thinking around this. In the mid-1800s, at the beginnings of the formalization of economics as a discipline, some basic questions about markets were being asked. What is price? What is competition? Adam Smith wrestled for decades on this whole question of where does price come from? Is it based on the intrinsic nature of the product? Over time, they would come around to the notion that price is what the market will pay. But it wasn't obvious. Another question was, what about competition? What is competition? Now, competition is so obvious to us today, it seems weird that you would even talk about it before. But in those days, you didn't have competitive markets. The reason you didn't have competitive markets is because you didn't have like-for-like goods. Because you didn't have mass production, because you didn't have commodities, you didn't have true competition. Every product was different. This cobbler was making a different shoe than that cobbler. They were competing only in the loosest sense, but not because they weren't selling the same thing. But with the rise of the industrial age, and the factories in northern England in particular, you started to be able to make the same thing. You were making spoons and teacups and plates and clothing, and you started to see like for like. You could, two factories could make this very similar spoons, and now they were starting to ask, well, what would happen? How would they compete? Two economists, one Carnot and one Bertrand, took different sides of this. Carnot believed that as competitors came online, that they would conspire to take capacity offline to keep prices up. So if the demand for spoons was 10,000 per month, and one factory is making 8,000, another factory came on, they would not also make 8,000 because that would hurt everybody. Because you'd be flooding the market, too much capacity, prices would come down. So they would somehow, explicitly or implicitly, conspire to take capacity off the market and to prop prices up for everyone's benefit. Bertrand he said, well, I think they're going to compete on price. Rather than capacity, I think they're going to compete on price. And I think what they're going to do is the new factory is going to come in, and if it's one factory A is selling 8,000 spoons a year at $1, factory B is going to try to sell 8,000 spoons at 80 cents. And that they will compete, they will ratchet back and forth until they get to the marginal cost of production. And that he thought that competitive markets would tend to drive prices down. And that was pretty much the end of the conversation for about 100 years. Because we rarely had markets of true competition where it was a like for like. The internet brought all this back? The internet is the first marketplace that is, I would argue, it's the most competitive marketplace the world has ever seen, largely because the barriers to entry are so low. I mean, in old markets, it wasn't enough to make the same thing. You needed to get equal distribution. You needed to have equal brand, et cetera. The internet is one that sort of levels the playing field in all respects. I don't need to tell you this, but it makes it very easy to compete. The internet also has the quality of having a near zero marginal cost of production. So by Bertrand's formulation, zero becomes, not just a good idea, but the law. What he's saying is that in a competitive market, price falls to the marginal cost. That means that if the marginal cost is zero and the competition exists, that zero is going to be out there. Does that mean that zero is the only price? No. But it means that zero is going to be a price you either use or compete with. And I think that's largely describes the internet as we know it today. It stems from these theoretical observations of economics, but it is largely driven by the underlying marginal cost of production. It is not a choice. It is just the marketplace at work. And if you don't do it, someone will do it to you. The music industry found that to its cost. If you don't make your music free, that someone will make your music free for you. And that someone turned out to be pirates. It turned out to be individuals. It turned out to be all of us on some level. We made music free. We didn't make music free because we're bad people. Well, not all of us. We made music free because we could. It is the animal forces of digital economics at work, and we see this again and again. So sometimes it's pirates, sometimes it's competitors, but free tends to win. Okay, so one last historical example, and then we'll get into the tactics. There's a lot of weird things that happen as you switch from analog economics to digital economics, from atoms to bits. It tends to make a mockery of a lot of things we've been told. I'll tell a story that's originally told in Kevin Kelly's New Rules book. It's about the dawn of Moore's Law, basically. In 1963, Fairchild had invented the 1211 transistor. And the transistor did the same thing. It amplifies signals, the same thing as a tube. And they wanted to gain market share in the big tube market of the day, which was the UHF television tuners. Now, RCA was selling their tubes at $1.05, and it cost $100 to make one of those first transistors. So what were they going to do? What they understood is that the semiconductor materials were going to fall in price much faster than analog electronics, and that production efficiencies would bring those prices down. So they needed to get their volume up. So what they did is although it cost them $100 to make a 1211, they offered it for sale at $1.05. Crazy, crazy, crazy under cost. And obviously they were going to lose $99 on the first one and so on. Well, what happened is 2 years later, they had more than 90% of the market. And they had driven the tube out, and they were selling millions of these things. And what had it done to the cost? It had, in fact, brought the cost down, not to $1.05, but 2 years later to 50 cents. The volume, they'd sold ahead of the price. They had created demand by lowering cost, and that by Say's law, supply creates its own demand. That had increased the volume so much that their costs fell even faster than projected. Now, this sounds like the old joke, right? I lose money on everyone, but I make it up on volume. And yet it's exactly what happened. It worked. You lose money on everyone, but you make it up in volume. YouTube loses money on every stream, but it makes up in volume. Is it making money today? No. But it's going to make money tomorrow. It's gained share, it's gained audience attention, it's galvanized the industry into finding a new advertising model that's going to work as well for video as it did for text, and odds are they'll find a way to turn that into money. So will Twitter, so will Facebook, so will all the other companies that we're laughing at today. Now, obviously, you can't lose billions on the way. You need to keep your costs relatively low. But the beauty of digital economics is that because the cost keeps falling, whatever it's costing you, whatever you're losing today, you're going to lose less tomorrow. That is new and unique and explains a lot of these underlying pricing trends. So one thing you hear a lot is that you can't compete with free. I would argue that you can compete with free, and as a matter of fact, we all do in one way or another. This confidence that you can compete with free comes from looking at Microsoft. Here we are in the Microsoft research facilities, and so with hopefully their forgiveness, I'll use them as an example as the company who has competed with free longest than any other in history. In 1970s, Bill Gates needed to convince people to pay for software in the first place. Software was something you got for free when you bought the mini computer or the mainframe. The computer industry was a hardware business, and software was just something that you were given, like the instruction manual, to help it work. What Bill Gates created as one of the first standalone software companies, and so he needed to create an economic model that would support such companies, and that would involve paying for software by itself. So he wrote an open letter to hobbyists saying, if you don't pay for the software, we won't be able to make you more software. And by and large, this worked. People understood that there was a virtue in paying for software, and many people did. But not all, as we'll come to in a minute. The 1980s, they had to compete with free in a different way. This is the beginning of the personal computer age. And their competitor, Microsoft's competitors in desktop software, started bundling their software with computers, with new computers. Now, they did this because the marginal cost of production, marginal cost of putting a copy of WordPerfect on a new PC is 0, and the hope would, and the only costs are opportunity costs, and the hope would be that you would get WordPerfect on your computer, it would suit your needs, you would save your documents in WordPerfect format, learn the keystrokes, etc., and when it came time to upgrade, you'd pay full price. So it was an upgrade plan, you started free, it's the free razor, and ultimately you would sell, well, paid razors, but okay, you can see the analogy. Microsoft competed with this by releasing Microsoft Works, their own version of free word processor, Excel, etc., which would lock people into their file formats, and by and large that worked, and WordPerfect stopped being a factor in the marketplace. In the 1990s, they had to compete with two things. First, piracy, especially in China. I was living in China at the time for most of the 90s, half of the 90s, and it was fascinating watching the pirate markets at work. Again, pirates are the animal forces of economics at work. Now, Microsoft was against piracy, and I probably need to say this again. Microsoft is against piracy, but they didn't drop a nuke. They could have been much more severe in their protection. But Bill Gates famously said in a rare moment of candor that he wasn't terribly worried about it. What he said was, China's a developing economy. Someday they'll be more developed, they'll have more money. If they're going to pirate software, we want them to pirate our software. And when they're ready to pay, maybe they'll pay for us. This worked brilliantly. And not only did it turn out to be true that China did develop, but by making the software free, it lowered the cost of computing and helped China develop faster. So by not being incredibly ruthless and cracking down on piracy, they helped create a market that they could ultimately monetize. Meanwhile, on the internet, Netscape was releasing the browser for free, which forced Microsoft to do the same, not only making IE free, but integrating the operating system, for which they were then sued on antitrust grounds. But we'll get to that in a minute. In the 2000s, they competed with open source. Now, how do you compete with open source? Originally, they competed with open source by pretending it was a bad idea and hoping it would go away, but ultimately they understood how to really compete with open source. You're not selling software. What you're selling is risk reduction. What they found is that big companies, Wall Street firms, etc., would tend to buy the software from Microsoft, not because the software was necessarily better, but because they were getting a service level agreement. They were getting a phone number they could call when things went wrong. They were getting a promise that some company was contractually required to ensure this worked. Now, when you look at the companies that are also selling open source software, MySQL, Apache, Linux, etc., the Red Hats and IBMs were also selling not the software, but the service level agreement. They were selling a contract. What they were selling was peace of mind. What they were selling was risk reduction. What they were selling was what these CIOs wanted most, which was someone who was legally bound to ensuring that their interests were protected. So now Microsoft realizes, once again, we're not in the software business. We're in the risk reduction business, and that works very well. And now we turn to the modern day, where they've decided to give away all their enterprise software for free to startups. If you're under 3 years old or under $1 million, you can have all of their enterprise software for free under something called BizSpark. What you have here is the Chinese pirates all over again. So think about it. What Microsoft learned in China is that if you take a developing economy and you let them have the software, or let's say don't stop them from getting the software for free, you'll not only help them develop, but once they've developed, they'll be hooked on your stuff. Entrepreneurs, startups, exactly the same thing. They're a developing economy. Lowering the cost of the software to them helps them develop faster, and if they like the software and use it, they'll be more likely to pay for it when they've developed. So after you're 3 years old and $1 million in revenues, you need to pay, but then perhaps you'll be happy to. You understand the value. It's using free as a form of marketing. So the bane of my of talking about free right now is that free is very disruptive and tends to demonetize industries before it remonetizes them. And the newspaper industry and the media industry where I live in my day job is just completely freaked out. And we are seeing a sort of a once in a century, reforming of an industry, and it's very destructive. And they're blaming free on it. I would argue that's wrong. That free is not the problem for the newspaper industry. The problem is competition. What we've done is we've lost our monopoly over consumer attention because the tools of production are now democratized. And with that loss of monopoly meant we couldn't charge scarcity pricing for ads, and so we just got competition for attention, competition for ads, etc. We're also there's also competition. You also they have companies like Craigslist come along and demonetize classifieds, etc. But there's this big debate about whether the newspaper industry should quote unquote undo the mistakes they made 10 years ago, put the genie back in the bottle, and start charging for their sites. And it's considered a free versus paid debate. I would argue it's nothing of the sort. It is a free versus freemium. What the newspaper industry is actually going to do over the next few years is exactly what all of you as companies are going to do, which is figure out what's the premium to your free. Not to reject free, but to find some way to make money, to sell to your free consumers, to take some fraction of your audience and upsell them on a paid service. Freemium, I would argue, is the first 21st century business model. Freemium, as you know, is free plus premium, and it's the inversion of the free sample. Rather than giving away 1% of your muffins to sell 99%, you're giving away 90% of your goods for free and sell 10%, or 95%, or 80%, or the majority of what you make, you give away, and you do that as a form of marketing to reach the largest possible audience. That audience is not just exposed to your message, they're exposed to your product. They're allowed to use their product, and if they choose to convert, if you found some way to get them to start paying, they're paying for the right reason, which is that they get it, they understand it, they find out, they know what the value is, they figure out how it fits in their life, and they're happy to pay. And when you look at the difference between services that force you to pay up front and those who convert you to paid through freemium, the churn rates are much, much lower for the freemium models because the people converted with full knowledge of why this was a good deal, and they tend to pay more, the price insensitive. So what does freemium mean for the Wall Street Journal? Alan Murray, who runs WallStreetJournal.com, gave these sort of 5 principles. And it's just, again, it's kind of parochial. I'm talking about media, but I think you might be able to find some relevance in all of your own businesses. First of all, you've got to use free and paid. You need both. You absolutely need both. You can't make it an entirely paid. And entirely free has shown its limits as the advertising market has hit the skids. Interestingly, the things they charge for, rather the things they give away for free, are maybe what you would, the opposite of what you would think. They give away their most popular stuff. So if you come to a story via Google News, that's free. Much of the front page is free. Their exclusives are also free. Now you would say, well, isn't an exclusive scarcity? Isn't that exactly what you would charge for? And it turns out that it's just the opposite. If you don't make your exclusives free, other people will report on your exclusives, and they'll get all the traffic. So, as TMZ exclusively reported last night, Michael Jackson has died. TMZ gets no traffic. Whoever was reporting it would get all the traffic. And it turns out that, to reference my last book, The Long Tail, you've got the head of the curve, the most popular stuff. That's best to monetize with advertising. And then you've got the tail of the curve, the niche stuff, a very narrow, more narrow interest. And there people become, and that's best to monetize with direct payments. Because there's less competition in that space, people understand the value of that. They tend to be driven by professional interest, and they tend to become price insensitive. So again, the stuff they're charging for is niche stuff. It's the archives, it's the metal commodity trading stuff, etc. And they want to get very, very niche on that stuff. Again, less competition, clearer value to the user, less price sensitivity. So give away the head, sell the tail is their model. Now, I think the 2 most interesting markets to look at freemium business models and evolution are the video game market and the Apple iPhone apps. Let's start with video games. Video games are a fascinating industry in transition. They're going from a silver disc business to an online business. Music did that. As they moved from silver disc to online, the core product became free. Software, as it went from silver disc to online, software as a service, the core product went to freemium. Most software as a service companies use the freemium model. Video games, as they go from a $50 box you buy in the store to an online model, are going to free to play. Now, this started in Korea and then China. Just moving to the yes. But what you see with free-to-play is it's a psychological endeavor, which is to say, okay, free-to-play, at some point you want them to pay. How do you entice them to do it? How do you make it non-punitive? Not just like, ding, time's up, pay, but more sort of, ooh, shiny. You could have that. So I showed a picture of MapleStory, which is a Korean game very popular with kids. It's a good example of this. So what will people pay for? Well, they'll pay to save time. When you die in MapleStory, as a free user, you get back to a respawn point, and you need to trudge your way back to where you were. Or you can buy a reincarnation stone, and you get reincarnated right there on the spot. If you want to go to another world, you have to wait for the bus as a free user. But if you bought a teleportation stone, you can get there instantaneously. And if any of you have kids who are playing Club Penguin, Club Penguin is also free to play. At some point, your kids, and my kids have done many times, will come to you and say, Mom, Dad, can I have a credit card? Can I have your credit card? Why? I want to subscribe to Club Penguin. Why? I want a pet for my penguin. Status. I want a better igloo. I want to go to this cooler land. I want hair, clothing, etc. These are psychological things. You can still play the game. It didn't go ding, time's up, but you can play the game better, with more or faster or with better status if you're a paid user. Now, this is a decision they only make after they decide they want to play the game more, but they continue to reap the value in it. On Second Life, it's free to play. It's not really a game, but you get the idea. It's free to play. However, you want to put down roots, build something, you got to rent the land. You're lowering your risk. It doesn't disappear. Status is a classic example. People will, the internet is largely shifted to a reputation economy, and reputation is about status. I use Ning, the social networking platform, for one of my aerial robotics sites, DIY drones, and I pay them $35 a month to take the Ning branding off and take their ads off, and to otherwise make it look more professional, like a better site. I'm happy to do it because I'm so invested in that service. Ning is a classic freemium model. You could force people to pay, time's up, etc. But that's generally not best. The freemium models tend to fall under a couple categories. You do have time limited, 30 days free, then you pay. Not the best one. You have seat limited, 5 seats free, more paid, better. You have feature limited, Flickr Pro. Basic version free, more cooler, better stuff paid. If you're an engaged user, if you're a power user, if you really get it, you'll happily pay for that kind of stuff. It's terrific, by the way, to be able to have your best customers self-identify by using the service and then upsell them on things that they value, because these are not only people who are happy to pay, but they are your evangelists. They are your best promoters. These are the people who are driving the rest of the traffic to you with their heavy use of the service, and they're also paying you for the privilege. You can have storage and capacity. You can add more storage and capacity. Things like Gmail use that model. There's probably others that I'm not thinking of, but those are the basic things that you will get people to pay for. A simple thing like the time-money calculus that we see so often in games. Young people have more time than money. Fine, they're free. Older people have more money than time. They'll pay to save time. We see this across the board. Open source versus closed source is often a time-money calculus. Open source is free, but it's sometimes more trouble. And Microsoft, and I'm not just saying this because we're enjoying their air conditioning, Microsoft will always tell you that open source is free like a puppy. That's the time-money calculus at work. Now, by the way, I'm a huge open source advocate, and everything I do outside of my paid jobs is open source. I think it's a little. I won't fully endorse that theme, but there is some truth at the core of that, which is that you have to understand that you have the monetary economy, and then you have these other economies: attention economies, reputation economies, time economies. It's true. There's no such thing as a free lunch. But only if you consider these other economies. If you and I have lunch, and I pick up the tab, lunch was free to you in the monetary economy, but it wasn't free in time, it wasn't free in reputation, it wasn't free, maybe you passed some information to me, which is worth much more than the cost of the lunch. If you consider these economies into the non-monetary economies, the books balance. Ultimately you do pay. But importantly, you're not paying in money. And the question is, how do you convert these reputation and attention credits back into cash, one way or another? So I'm gonna end with that, and I think we've got about 15 minutes to take questions. Thanks very much. Thank you. I think it's a couple questions back there, and then we'll come over here. Yes, sir.
Hey, where do you stand on the micropayments model versus subscription?
Thanks. Great question. Micropayments. I actually addressed this in the book. My freemium strategy is I'll tell you everything I can in the time available, and then you can pay for the book outside, and I'll sign it for free. So the basic thing about micropayments is it's failed and failed and failed and failed again for two reasons, one of which is going to go away. The two barriers to micropayments in the past, and micropayments used to be defined as microcents. The two barriers were transaction costs. So the complexity of the transaction itself, pulling out credit cards, etc., and the psychological barrier. With a price comes a little psychological flag that comes up in your head, and you think, is it worth it? How much is it worth? Do I really want it, etc.? And that's considered a mental transaction cost, and every price carries with it a mental transaction cost. And Josh Kopelman, the venture capitalist, talks about the penny gap. And the penny gap is economically trivial, the difference between one penny and 0 pennies. But psychologically, it's night and day. And that's all because of the mental transaction costs of a price. The problem with microtransactions is that they had transaction costs in the mechanisms of paying and transaction costs in the psychology of paying. We're getting better at the mechanisms of paying. We're coming out between Facebook payments, PayPal, Apple, etc. It's going to be easier and easier to just one-click pay. We still have the psychological disincentives, the barrier. And what's interesting to me is that as we talk about micropayments today, if you look at the numbers they're talking about, it's 99 cents, 79 cents, $1.99. Those aren't micropayments, those are payments. Those are just standard transactions. So I think what we've done is, as we've taken one of those problems, the process of engaging the transaction, and made that easier and easier and easier, it'll definitely lower the barrier. But I don't think it's going to lower it down to a penny. I think we're finding it may lower it from $1.99 to 79, maybe 49 cents, etc. But I doubt we're going to see microcents the way it was originally prophesied in the early days of the internet. Yes. Okay. We'll take the microphones here, and then after this one, do we just have one microphone? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, then if you can sprint over there. Yes, sir.
One thing that I noticed was missing from most of the observations you were making was any assessment of differentiation in quality.
Yeah.
You were kind of looking at everything as being, I think the phrase you used was like versus like.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important component.
It absolutely is, yeah. Quality is a funky word these days. In the media business, it is oft heard that YouTube's full of crap, and where's the quality, etc. Well, quality, defined the old way, is about production quality. Take video, for example. Acting, screenwriting, lighting, sound, etc. I tell a story in the book about my children. They're allowed 2 hours of screen time every weekend. And it's like, okay, this weekend you get 2 hours of Star Wars. You get Star Wars, the DVDs, any one of the 6, upscaling DVD player, high-def screen, popcorn, surround sound, the works. Or you can go on YouTube and watch Star Wars stop-motion animations with Lego figures made by 7-year-olds. And they're like, YouTube! And as a matter of fact, they actually weren't all that interested in Star Wars. They actually really wanted to see YouTube stop-motion animations of little toy soldiers made by 7-year-olds. And the production quality of these videos is appalling, exactly as you would expect. Lighting, sound, etc. They put their thumbs in the finger, thumbs in the screen. It's a 7-year-old voice narrating, etc. That's what the kids want. And the lesson here is quality is about relevance. Quality is in the eye of the beholder. Your quality is not my quality. I want to watch surface mount soldering tutorials on YouTube. You want to watch what you want to watch. Equality is what we want, and the old standards don't count anymore. So, okay, not to say that quality isn't still a discriminator, but that it's very hard to be able to say, it's very hard to be able to sort of have a universal standard of what quality is. I think what we're finding is that it's very hard to determine a priori what's quality or not, and that's why we use free to introduce you to services so that you can assess whether it's relevant and a value to you. And if you find it valuable to you, if you set up your Ning site or your Facebook page, and actually I heard this morning that no one wanted to pay for Facebook pages, so there's probably some limits on this. But I think Gmail was the example of things they would pay for. Is Gmail higher quality than Yahoo Mail? 6 of one, half dozen another. It's either different. I don't know which one's higher quality. But the usage patterns that have built up over time of using Gmail may count as relevance and quality, and that's what they're willing to pay for. Over there. Yes, sir. No, sorry, the microphone just behind, and then we'll come down to you.
Hi, Chris. Thanks very much. Just wanted to say I completely agree with the freemium model working. I'm with Evernote. It totally works for us. We've been running a freemium model on a fairly large scale for about a year. Every time we do any experimentation with what should be free, what should be premium, we just see better and better results. I'm extremely optimistic about the future of this model on the internet. Completely, I think, contrary to a lot of the conventional wisdom, especially the ones that we've heard from the first two panels about how it's tough to make money online. It really hasn't been that tough, and really the secret to it is to give really useful stuff away for free, and then do it at a cost that's very low to you, and then just make sure that some small but ever-growing percentage winds up paying you, and it works great.
Okay, so I guess there wasn't a question there, but I will make an observation based on that. The first wave of the internet was build big audiences, bring it down here, build big audiences, and then slap the old monetization model, which was ads, against it. The second wave of the internet was to be a little smarter about the ads. That was Google AdSense. And now we've seen the limits of advertising. Advertising is not going to float all boats. And so now as we switch to freemium, we got to get a little smarter. Rather than, here's a product people like, build a big audience, throw ads against it, we now have to build at least 2 products. One free product and one paid product. Or ideally, one free product and many paid products. And the first wave of the iPhone apps was $9.99 or free. And now we're realizing that now we've got sort of, free and then another version. Starts with free and then goes to 99 cents or $1.99. And now as the iPhone is building, iPhone 3.0 software has a built-in microtransaction engine within it. It's like, okay, the software is free and you're starting to pay for downloaded tracks, more content, more features, and you start to pay within, in this kind of granulated marketplace within the app itself. It just requires us to be more thoughtful. We have to actually, we have to think about the products ahead of time. And not just in terms of their popularity, but also their revenue models. Yes, sir. And then I think the gentleman in front would take it next. Yes, sir.
So my question is, if you look at software which has high NREs to develop, like Windows or Office, right? And it makes sense to sort of let the piracy happen, so it locks people into the format. But if you compare that to the premium content industry, like a blockbuster movie, you have a similar model where you have the high NRE, essentially zero distribution costs. But there's no. I mean, other than sequels, what's the lock-in and how does that equate?
Yeah, well, great question. I mean, the lock-in right now is called DRM. And that's only going to last so long. I don't think we've figured. So I don't think we've quite figured out. With newspapers, we'll sort that out. In my business, we'll sort it out. We'll use some combination of advertising and freemium. With software, we've answered. With things like movies, I suspect it's going to be a combination of things. I think some people still will buy the DVDs, still will go to the theater. I think what we're seeing is we're going from a marginal cost, from a near zero marginal cost of production to a near zero marginal cost of consumption. That's the other side of the economic thing. With Netflix. Right now, so at $14.95, I have a near zero marginal cost of. I have a zero marginal cost of. Actually, I have a near zero marginal cost of consumption, which is that I can watch as many DVDs, I can watch as many movies as I want over that period. And the more movies I watch, the less it costs me for each one. Now, because the marginal cost of production of those streams is so low, the industry can make more money, even though I'm paying less per film. And again, that's just letting the underlying economics of the medium drive it. It's a volume business, right? You just try to use digital economics to increase your volume, and even though you're making less money on each one, the overall sum might be more. Yes, sir.
Can you tell me specifically how you see newspapers using micropayments? I'm having a hard time visualizing what stories I'm going to pay for, what they're going to give me free, why I would pay, how much I would pay.
So I suspect newspapers will by and large, not use micropayments. We in the media business understand subscriptions really well. It's based upon, we want reoccurring revenues, you want predictability, you want to build a community, you want a kind of an ongoing trust relationship. So I suspect what the newspapers are going to do is they're not going to say, the old model was subscribe or you don't get it. The new model, then the new model was it's free, everyone can get it. Then the next model will be it's free to some, but if you really want more, if you're really invested, $4.95 a month, $5.95 a month. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times iPhone apps right now are free. I would expect those to become paid over time. I think all of them are going to, I don't think, in other words, I think there will be an opportunity to do micropayments, probably for archival stuff. The Wall Street Journal has the financial information from Barron's, et cetera. So you can imagine there's kind of a Bloomberg model kicking in at some point there. But that's, again, I think it's more likely to be a kind of a higher tier subscription model than it's going to be micropayments. It's going to go. The questions go where the microphones are. And you're watching hands going up. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
So in the start, you had a slide that said that it goes to the sort of lowest denominator.
Yeah.
You know, it goes to whoever is offering the service for the cheapest. So initially, you know, health insurance, for instance,
right.
It was health insurance or life insurance was similar products sold at different prices all over the country. The reason they started became competitive is because of the information age. And you are now able to see that there are different products.
Exactly.
That, you know, what they were, and then you could compare the products that were the same. And then because of that, you were able to drive the price down. You were able to you know, shop around and so forth. So the question is, you know, in today's market, you have this premium model here. You know, you have all these free services that are offered, and then you're supposed to get money in the tail end. So, but also there is an overload of information. You know, there's so many products out there. So how do you get in, you know, in this overloaded sort of information age where you may not have the resources to kind of last through the free zone to get to the premium area?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously you try to go where the competition isn't, right? So, so free is going to be a price out there, one way or another. But you know, I would not recommend that you launch a web-based email service right now, competing with Yahoo and Google. I mean, that is obviously what it would take to equal their size. I mean, you know, Microsoft, God, we keep picking on Microsoft. Microsoft is now competing in search, right? They're spending a huge amount, well, they've always been competing in search, but now they're competing more seriously. They're going to spend a huge amount of money to buy market share. I mean, literally, they've had products where they would pay you to search. It's not free, it's less than free. They pay you. You know, a Microsoft can do that. The average startup can't. What you obviously need to do is you need to have a product that is different, you know, different enough from those other products, and make it free. The beauty of being small and free is that your marginal is that you don't have to buy lots of servers, et cetera, and that, you know, your marginal costs are, your fixed costs are still pretty high, but your marginal costs are pretty low because the usage is low. Free is enticing. Now, as free starts to build up and you get those big audiences, you have to buy more servers, et cetera, but that's a good problem to have. At that point, you know you have market share and you can monetize it. So I would say the simple answer to your question is try to differentiate. Don't try to use, you can't use price to win market share because it's all going to be, you know, everyone's going to have the starting price of 0. Instead, use product differentiation. The microphone is over here.
In a model where you're
I don't think the microphone's on or you're not talking into it.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
In the model where you have a subscription content site, you're offering a service, you said that like a 30-day free wouldn't be a best way to go. Do you have other suggestions to get members to stay? Yeah, I mean, you know, 30 days free is okay. The problem is you're giving people a very easy opportunity to say, no, bye, I'm done. You know, a better one is to sort of say, you know, you give them enough free so that they get utility out of it. Not sort of, you know, the first paragraph free and you have to pay for the rest, but real utility, and then you start upselling them on features and services that are more. At that point, they're sophisticated enough to be receptive. It's not spam, etc. I mean, look, plenty and plenty of companies, including very smart ones, use the 30-day free model. The problem with that, especially in the enterprise space, is I'm not going to commit to a product if I know that the timer is going to go off in 30 days. I'm not going to really give it a full trial, and therefore my conversion likelihood goes down. Much more likely, I'd much rather do a 5-seat free, pay more, because I'm getting real utility out of that, and I'm not going to waste my investment in it if I never go beyond if I don't go beyond 5 seats. Where the microphone is, right here.
Hi. My question's regarding free and wide. My understanding of the website is that the same articles come out in some form slightly after the hard copy.
No, not true, but go ahead.
Oh, well, there's similar articles that are in the magazine.
Yeah.
What happens, and the whole concept of wide is that your articles are essentially what's new and cool, or a large part of them are what's new, cool, and topical, and sort of the next big thing.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of free versions of that in blogs, obviously not
Right.
as good quality. I'm a big fan of Wired, so I mean, I buy it. But how are you going to adapt to Wired with in the free world?
Great question. So what we do, it's a classic freemium strategy. What we do is we give away everything we do for free, but not in the superior form. So what troubles me in what you said, and what troubles me is not that you said it, but that everyone believes that, is that the story you're reading online is in fact the same experience as the magazine. Now in a newspaper, that's probably true, that online story is pretty much like the print story. Magazines like Wired, and our sister publications are Vogue and Vanity Fair and GQ and New Yorker, etc. These are primarily a visual medium, where it's paper, it's glossy, it's photography, it's design. I mean, we're largely known as design-centric. It's this incredible packaging of idea and this visual spectacle. When you go online, it all falls to pieces, right? The text is just HTML, the pictures are thumbnails, the design's completely lost. And our problem, so our model is that we convert some fraction of the online readership to print because they want this superior experience. Now, visually superior, maybe it's just that they can read it in the bathroom. I don't know, but it is superior. The problem is that not enough people know that the print experience is superior. So our challenge is to illuminate, hint at the print experience in the online experience. And I'm just imagine if it says, from the magazine, if you were just a mouse over from the magazine, there'd just be a little sort of pop of what it looks like in the magazine, not obscuring anything, just a little glimpse of, whoa, that doesn't look anything like the page here. There's some cool design stuff, photography going on. Click on that, then you're getting a glimpse of what it really looks like in the magazine, which you can read. However, if you don't want to have to go through that process, $10 a year, please. Okay. We're running out of time, so I'll take the questions as quickly as possible. We can talk afterwards. I'm going to be signing books. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the perception of free, and if you have kids that play Club Penguin, you might have kids that also play Webkins.
Yeah.
And that struck me as a particularly interesting business model where it seems like the subscription is sort of bundled into the actual animal.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I don't know if there's other models like that.
Yeah, I talk about Webkins in the book. There's also Neopets, etc. A lot of toy companies, Lego, etc., are using free games as a form to market products. Sometimes, in the case of Webkins, as you said, the game is free to play. But the characters are unlocked by buying the toy, and the toy comes with a code. Likewise with the Lego games, the toys come with a code, and it gives you a better experience. The ones with the non-zero marginal costs, the physical goods cost money. The ones with the near-zero marginal costs become marketing for the physical goods, and you get this interplay between the two by which you're extending the utility of the Atoms version with bits at no additional cost to the manufacturer. It's very clever. Marketing to children. Watching the marketing to the Google generation as they're very young is a fascinating experiment in the psychology of getting a generation that knows they don't have to pay to nevertheless want to pay. Yeah.
I go through the same thing with my son asking me whether he should pay $2,000 for a bathtub in Webkins. But my question is on the freemium model with a tiered service model. Do you have any thoughts on number of tiers and when it becomes confusing?
Yeah.
The second question is to get people to move up to tiers, what do you think about a 30-day free to upgrade once they're already part of the service to upgrade to a higher tier?
Explain a little bit more. 30 days free to upgrade. So it's not 30 days and you're kicked off, but 30 days. What happens at 30 days?
Well, no, it's 30. You get an upgrade for 30 days to try the next higher level of service, and then
adding
you are
features.
kicked off back to the free level.
Understood. Yeah, and that's interesting to add features for 30 days to see what they're like, and that's better than 30 days and you're off. I think. So the upside of 30-day free trials that you're already pretty invested in the service because you're using the basic service for free, and you're able to sample these things. You're not just sort of having some advertising bump about what it's about, but you're able to sample. The bad news of that is, again, the level of commitment in those new features will be minimal. So let's say it's an enterprise software thing, and these features would be available to all your users. No IT manager in the right mind would expose these features to their users if they knew that at the end of 30 days they'd be removed. So I don't think you'd get so the downside is that you wouldn't get a full trial, full commitment, a full exploration of whether these are higher utility. But it's certainly better than kicking them off entirely. And maybe some subgroup could be a beta trial group. So I think that's an interesting model. Worth trying.
What about number of tiers?
No, number of tiers. You know, there's no, again, this is the problem with freemium, is that every product is different, every community is different, every marketplace is different, every company is different. There is no one model. My general feeling is that 3, you got, you know, free and 2 paid tiers is a good model. Beyond that, it does get pretty confusing. Obviously, in the enterprise software space, all prices are negotiable and you can pay per feature, but I like 3. Yes, sir.
Hi. We talk a lot about B2C, about like 99 cents per something, or where do you see this trend in enterprise software, where there are sales of $50,000 or $100,000 for something very complex, plus the maintenance, etc. How this movement is going to touch this market that is so far quite immune to those like B2C or 99 cents transactions? Thanks.
You know, I don't have any really good answers for you there. I do think that if you match price with utility, people feel better about it. So let's say that you're charging not sort of, you know, in $10,000 increments, but on a kind of very clear per seat. You've got tiered seats, 5, 50, 500, you know, etc. If the cost per seat is lower than you would find in traditional enterprise software, it feels pretty fair, even though the lump sum of going to that next tier can be tens of thousands of dollars. So again, you know, I mean, the question is, do you want to portray it on a per seat basis? You know, $2 per seat. You know, $1.99 per seat. Do we as IT purchasers, are we seduced by that same consumer psychology as consumers are? I don't know. I think it's an interesting experiment. I think it is one of the price and psychology is a fascinating domain. The fact that $2.99 works for us, although we're smart people, we've been to college. We know that $2.99 is $3, and yet it still works for us. That suggests that it's probably something that we should use in enterprise software as well. And I mean, numbers like $10,000. I mean, you can make it $9,999.99, but it would be interesting to see if you could portray it on a kind of a per seat basis and make it look like, you know, $1.99 a seat, and see whether that works on us smart IT guys as well. Experiment worth doing. Next one is, yes, sir.
Paper printing media, they are losing ground very fast nowadays to the internet versions. So my question is actually, what fraction of the losing business they could retain with their corresponding internet version based on your partial pay, partially free model?
I missed the first couple words. What business are we talking about?
Newspapers and magazines in papers, paper printing.
Right. Right. So your question is, so they're actually, papers are not losing audience that much.
Newspapers
are losing print audience, but they tend to you know, typically the internet has given newspapers larger audiences as a whole. The problem is these audiences are not regular, they're not committed in the same way, and they're often not paying. So Google, you know, there's a lot of complaints in the world of newspapers about Google News. Google News drives a huge amount of traffic to newspapers. However, a lot of that traffic is superficial. It's hard to monetize. Sometimes people extract all the value they need simply from the headlines on Google News and never click through at all. So it's not really about the size of the audience. It's about the monetization ability of those audiences. And I predict the newspaper industry is going to be smaller. I think it's going to be fewer newspapers. I think those newspapers are going to have lower revenues. I think the newsrooms are going to be smaller. The big buildings are going to be smaller. I just think that's going to happen. However, I think that the function of news is going to be much larger. It's just going to be done by more non-newspaper institutions. So, you know, covering your community is going to be something you're probably going to do on kind of an amateur level. Covering you know, Baghdad is probably going to be done on a professional level. The idea that the newspaper should do both, cover the micro and the macro, is probably not going to happen anymore. And so newspapers are going to do what, professional media is going to do what it does best, which is the big stories, the stories that need resources and time, etc. And that amateur media is going to do what it does best, which is covering the granular, the narrow, the very relevant and very sort of grassroots.
So you were saying the reduction is the
I think
volume.
The newspaper industry, as narrowly defined, is going to be smaller tomorrow than it is today, but it's not going away.
But is that the short-term picture or long-term picture?
I mean, 100 years from now, I don't know what a newspaper means anymore. What is this paper of which you speak? You know, but you know, the news business is probably going to be a bigger business. Traditional news institutions will probably be smaller. Last question. There was a hand up right there. Sorry.
Hello? Yeah, I recently came across this product called Zenio.
Yeah.
Online, where you can actually page through the print version of magazines.
Yeah.
And having lived abroad and been in different countries, I thought that was fascinating. You could see magazines in full color view of that and actually get that print experience on your computer. Do you have any thoughts about or comments about how print versions of things are now showing up on the electronic medium or things like Kindle and where that's taking us? Can you comment on that, please?
Sure. I'll comment on Zenio in a second. Let me just first tell you about what I'm doing with my book. So I'm walking, I'm walking the talk on the book. It's a freemium model. We charge for atoms and we give away the bits for free. So the book is available for free in Scribd and Google Books, and it'll be out on the Kindle for free next week. The audio book is free, download MP3s. All the bits are free, sometimes time limited, sometimes feature limited, you can't print it out. So, it's locked to a certain reader. Sometimes not limited at all. Meanwhile, we're selling the physical book. And the argument is that the digital book is a great sampling device. It's a great way to do what free does best, which is spread awareness and recognition to the largest possible audience. You then convert some fraction of them to the superior print version. Great battery life, great screen resolution, looks good on your shelf. Fold the pages, underline, etc. Exactly as we do with the magazine. Convert some fraction of the web audience to the print audience, and only that fraction who value the superior qualities of print. Not everybody. And then, that's the model. Zenio was an attempt to do the same thing. Zenio's been around for a long time, and I actually didn't like most of the earlier incarnations. I think the early ones required a download. It was an executable. It was kind of kludgy, and we rejected it a few times. I think we're all coming back to the notion that we need better, sort of more web-friendly screen reader types to, again, illuminate the virtues of the print experience in a digital context. And I don't know whether Zenio or Texterity or Adobe Air or any one of these other, or Flash, is going to be the platform that we choose going forward, but I think you'll see most of us choosing this. The Kindle being a very good example. The Kindle right now is black and white, has a low refresh rate, so it's the New Yorker, one of our sister publications, went to the Kindle. Where this, if you've seen Wired, where this incredibly colorful, design-centric photographic thing just does not work on the Kindle. If, say, a company in Cupertino were to produce a new device that had an incredibly good screen resolution and allowed us to do what we do best, which is visual packaging of stories, and this device became ubiquitous, we would stop killing trees tomorrow. We are not wedded to paper. We're wedded to the impact of the full visual medium, and we'd love to switch to digital distribution when the devices are in place. Right, exactly. We're out of time. Thank you so much. Signing books outside.